So, Fakelore is a thing. I didn't know about it 2 weeks ago. I just found out about it. So, I'll give you the background and we'll talk about Fakelore. It's kind of a neat idea. And it ties into a project that I started working on. So, I had a dream, which is how sometimes my writing ideas come to me. In this dream, I had a dream of a book. Now, normally my dreams aren't very complex as far as the narrative goes, and I'll preface things with that. That's why this was kind of a special one to me. Yeah, usually when I dream about something, things are very vague and there's not really much of a plot, right? I dream in kind of general ideas. Now, I'm sure I have regular dreams with storylines and such, but I very rarely remember my dreams in the first place. I certainly don't remember many of those. I don't like people saying, I don't dream, because I have been told by scientists that everybody dreams. That's a part of sleep. So for whatever reason, I just don't remember any of my dreams. Even waking up from one, I usually can't tell you what I was dreaming about. But this one, I remembered fairly vividly. It takes place in the future, and it took place like hundreds of years after a great catastrophe of some sort had led to a wasteland situation. Very similar to like Mad Max, Fallout, that kind of post-apocalypse. And maybe A Boy and His Dog as well. If you're not familiar with that story, Don Johnson movie, very interesting apocalyptic take. So, yeah, it was that kind of world. A few hundred years after that kind of world, there was a book that existed that collected the folklore of that post-apocalypse. Now, the idea of apocalyptic folklore, that was one I thought was kind of interesting. The idea of, like, if society were to collapse tomorrow and we're all living in a radiated wasteland, what would be like the tall tales that we ended up telling? Because humanity loves stories. Humanity loves spreading stories. And I am very much a believer that we would have our own new myths and legends if society were to collapse. Because we already do that with things like our superhero movies. Not even superhero movies, but movies in general. If you saw Reign of Fire, which you should, because it's really underrated movie, and it's bananas, but very fun. It's about dragons waking up, and there's like it's like a post-apocalyptic thing, but like the dragons are the apocalypse. And in there, it shows like they're telling stories around the campfire like they normally do in humans, but they're telling Star Wars as if it's an old legend. That was super cool to me. So I had the idea for writing the book that was in my dream, The Tall Tales of the Post-Apocalypse. It would be a collection of like post-apocalyptic themed folklore. And when I started looking that up, as far as like genre goes, that's when I discovered Fakelore, which apparently is a real thing. So folklorists, they're people who study folklore as like a job, right? Or I guess a hobby as well. They're people that study folklore, the meanings of different folklore, where it comes from, the purpose for why it was told, things like that. And they coined the term Fakelore. They're the ones who use it for something that is meant to seem like folklore, but is actually like made up for that purpose. So, for example, And these are things I did not know these were Fakelore at the time until I was researching more of this. But I grew up in when we moved here from England, in the American Southwest is where we moved to, and I stayed there until after college. So that American Southwest, very much a part of my identity. And part of that was the tale of Pecos Bill. Um, my grandfather, who, he was a cowboy, both of them were on both sides there. Rodeo guys, horse riding guys, uh, seasonal ranching, that kind of thing. They had both told me the story of Pecos Bill when I was very small. And my grandmother, she had some VHS tapes. She did not have very many of them. Um, there was like the Smurfs, the Care Bears, the Ninja Turtles, and a Robin Williams narrated version of Pecos Bill. Pecos Bill was a story that I got very familiar with. And his girlfriend, later wife, Slewfoot Sue. But I found out that those are not American folklore. That's the way it was presented to me, was that like these are the stories that cowboys told to each other, but that's not the case at all. They're actually a series of short stories later turned into a book just 100 years ago that had no basis in folklore. It was a guy trying to write to sound like folklore. And that's one of the things that I started noticing the more I got into it. American folklore is, by its nature, it would need to be relatively recent, right? Because the continent, it was settled by an entirely different group of human beings, and they had their own folkloric traditions, many of which, survive on through their survivors, not in the general population, public consciousness. But that's a whole colonization thing, and that's horrible, nasty stuff that needs its own video to talk about. Probably one that's a lot less off the cuff. We'll give that topic the research and gravitas that it deserves. But as far as the folklore goes, so one thing you'll notice is the fantasticism of certain stories. And so what we consider to be genuine folklore, as far as what the folklore is considered to be genuine folklore, it's a little bit fantastical by its nature as folklore, but it's not too outlandish. Whereas the folklore, because that is written to be fake, the folklore is specifically written to sound like a myth, basically. That tends to be a little more out there and impossible. And so I started thinking about Pecos Bill in that context. And, Pecos Bill had two rattlesnakes. One was a whip, one was a lasso. Now, I could kind of see that, raised by coyotes. I could kind of see, as far as a folklore tradition, that's okay. But then he uses one of those rattlesnakes to lasso a tornado. Then we're starting to get into territory where this is, there's not even a moral to that story like there is with a lot of mythology. Contrast that to something like John Henry. John Henry's story isn't that fantastical, save for the detail that he beat the machine and then, it led to his death. Part of the John Henry story, according to the folklorists that I could find who had done research on the topic and written about it, one of the original lessons of John Henry wasn't necessarily about the automation itself. When you're building a railroad as part of a crew, everybody's working together and everybody needs to be working at the same pace. And you need to pace yourself throughout the day so you don't wear out early, because that slows the work down. And if one person is out of pace with everyone, let's say because they're trying to show off and do too much of it on their own too quickly, that screws up everyone else's pace and actually slows down the work itself. And when the railroad can't be built, those people who are already making almost nothing, there's justification for the company to not pay them. It's basically a story of don't work too hard because it's bad for you. Not in a lazy way even necessarily, but more in a practical way, like pacing yourself, keeping a decent pace, and not doing it on your own are actually much better for you in the long run. John Henry paid the cost for that. Later on, as industrialization continued and America entered the Gilded Age, we started seeing more of John Henry's stories being about a struggle against industrialization and automation. They still work for that purpose. It's one of the great things about a tall tale is that it can be adaptable. American mythology can be very adaptable. But at its core, even with changing the sentiment of the story slightly, the details remain the same and they're not very outlandish. Paul Bunyan is an interesting hybrid example for me, because Paul Bunyan did start as the folklore of American lumberjacks, starting up in Canada. We don't know for sure, but likely in French Canada, where the logging industry really got started. They told stories about Paul Bunyan, and the original folk tales that we have, he's more of like a shrewd businessman. And he's a giant, but still a human being. And so, like, when he's described as being huge, it's more like he's like 6'5", 6'6". He towers over people, but he's still, realistically a human being. And sometimes he's presented as more of like a trickster god kind of guy, where like this is a clever thing that Paul Bunyan did as a boss, or like these are some people that he tricked. And he was a great logger, but still a human being. But the logging industry appropriated him to use for advertising. And most of the tall tales that we have about Paul Bunyan, they're not actually the folklore. He's a blend of folklore and fakelore as a character, because what we have are stories that were made up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s by logging companies, people who would have been sort of at odds with the mythological Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan was, he was a foreman, so he was kind of a boss, but he was also one to look out for his workers a little more than the company would. He would be opposed to the company. The company were the exploiters, while they were the laborers. Interestingly, these stories started coming up during the labor movement in North America, and when that was starting to spread from miners into places like logging. We've got the company who owns the logging rights. They start publishing stories about Paul Bunyan, and he's no longer really like a trickster god who looks out for his crew. He's instead a 50-foot tall giant who made the Great Lakes with his footprints. The same with the lakes of Wisconsin. Just walking through Wisconsin with an ox who was inexplicably as large as he was, making a bunch of lakes, dragging his axe behind him to make the Grand Canyon, which is also not good for the axe. I feel like a mythological lumberjack would probably want to take better care of his equipment. So the Paul Bunyan stories, that one was probably the most interesting for me as far as Fakelore goes, because he started as something that was genuine, and then everything that everyone knows about his legend, that's all the stuff that was added less than 100 years ago by a company, basically. It's sort of like with the Santa Claus situation, where Santa Claus was relatively undefined as opposed to now. And Coca-Cola's advertising really cemented the look of Santa Claus in American pop culture. That's really all I have to say. There's a bunch of fake lore out there, and a lot of it's been passed off as genuine American mythology. Um, Another one that comes straight to mind is the story of Joe Magarac. That one is kind of weird to me because when I was in elementary school, we had a lesson on tall tales in music class because a lot of these figures do have songs written about them. We had music class twice a week at the time, and it was one week where both classes we talked about tall tales, mythology, folklore, and we listened to songs. And we learned about Joe Magarac because there was a Joe Magarac song. And I don't know anyone else who's ever heard of Joe Magarac. Joe Magarac was a steel worker. He was partly made of iron. And he worked in Pittsburgh in the steel mill. There was a problem with the purity of the steel they were working with, and he climbed into the forge because he was made of pure iron. In the story that I got, I believe it was his heart that was pure iron. Anyway, yeah, that one is again outlandish. This is a man who has a body part that's made of pure iron. And somehow this was passed off to me as genuine mythology when I was about 9 or 10. And yet, like I said, I don't know anyone who's actually heard the story of Joe Magarac. Even, I would think, Pittsburgh. I've met people from Pittsburgh who never heard of the story. I would have assumed that a steel town like Pittsburgh, that would have been, it would have come up to the youth there. But it didn't. I did find the song on Spotify, and the detail that they told us in the story, that Magarac means jackass, and that was a nickname given to him when he came to America from the Czech Republic because he was stubborn. Yeah, interesting stuff. Look up Fakelore if you ever have a chance. I'm done for this one for today. If you want to like, share, and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. That helps out the channel. It helps out me. I just got into the double digits. That's very exciting. So I would love for you guys to see more of my videos, but I would love to get more new viewers as well. And liking, sharing, subscribing, that's how that happens. Hit that bell notification icon. You'll get a notice from YouTube anytime I post something new. Share with your friends so that they can, enjoy my content. If you would be so obliged as to want to maybe give me some money for this content, that would be fantastic. I've got the Patreon back up. So patreon.com/touchbone. That's where you can find this stuff. And Touchbone, there are some subscription exclusives like access to my works in progress and everything. You can see the stuff that I'm working on a little bit early. There's some other things like drawings and stuff that are also a part of that. But yeah, I think you guys are great, and thank you for following and enjoying the things that I make. And I'll see you guys later. I've got some more videos in the works for you. I hope you have a great day, and love you very much. Bye.